we're very excited to welcome Zine today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much, Carol, for your wonderful introduction, and thanks to Institute for Immigration Research for sponsoring this event. So I think for the new book, first I would love to present the overall themes and goals. So my first book, Folk Literary, Contextual Tradition and Heritage in Contemporary China, is really about the remaking of traditions and heritage in contemporary China. So before the COVID pandemic started, I started my second project to study the transmission of Buddhism among lay women in rural China. But then the COVID broke out and I couldn't travel back to China. And then by chance, I started to collaborate with a group of scholars in different fields in China to study the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. So the project started in 2022. I collaborated with many amazing scholars and also student research assistants since then. So the book was published last August. I'm really happy for that, but it's really a product of many collaborations with many communities, groups, and people. But because of very complicated reasons in my acknowledgements, I couldn't name those people in their names, but I think this book belongs to them all. So for the book, I intended to examine how Chinese and Chinese American women, especially Chinese immigrant mothers, international students, transracial adoptees, and lay Buddhist women were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in the US through studies of anti-Asian racism, political activism, identity crisis, and cultural changes. So one of my main contributions is to advance action-based, future-oriented global Asian folklore studies. It's the integration of the studies of global Asia with new critical folklore studies. So I emphasize the transnational, interdisciplinary, intersectional, decolonial, and community-engaged approaches. I think it's kind of the integration of both global Asian studies and the new critical folklore studies. So I basically borrowed all the brilliant ideas from the pioneer work from scholars in both Asian studies and folklore studies. So my goal is to contribute to public health and social justice efforts by addressing multiple crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian racism, and anti-racist activisms. So for each chapter, I sometimes give like policy recommendations. So the purpose is to develop strategies and policies to combat racism and support marginalized groups, especially Chinese and Chinese American women and AAPI women. So here, AAPI refers to Asian American and Pacific Islands. As I introduced in my book, this term was used by my former student when they organized the annual AAPI Arts Festivals at the College Wooster. Then I used this term AAPI in my book. So what has the pandemic taught us about racism? So Chinese and Chinese American women studied in the book highlight intersecting power structures of race, ethnicity, and gender, both during the COVID-19 pandemic and in everyday lives. So as I highlight in my book, racism exists everywhere, all the time. So the COVID-19 pandemic just exaggerated the anti-Asian racism. The pandemic exacerbated long-standing racialized discrimination, especially anti-Asian rhetorics. I emphasize that there are multiple forms of racism which are situated within particular social, political, and historical contexts. Folklore studies sometimes fail to engage with broader racial and social dynamics, but I think the situation has changed recently. So many scholars including scholars here at George Mason and students, have engaged in racial and social dynamics and other important issues actively. So overall, the purpose is to seek actionable solutions to improve situations for marginalized groups. In the book, I highlight the gendered experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think based on many scholarship and news reports and other reports, it is believed that the COVID-19 pandemic caused the largest setback to gender inequalities in modern history. Some scholars and journalists argue that women's rights probably withdraw for decades or even more. And the Global Gender Gap Report states that it may take us 132 years to close the gender gap. So the pandemic affects almost everyone in the world. The impacts differ by culture, religion, and politics, but share some gendered dimensions. So in the book, I gave many detailed personal narratives articulated by my contributors. They just articulate their struggles and challenges during the pandemic. For example, the stay-at-home orders increased women, especially mothers' risks and burdens. And the economic distress and job losses concentrated among women and also people of color. There were also heightened risks, including sexual abuse, adolescent pregnancy, early marriage, trafficking, poverty, etc. For women. And there were also threats to sexual and bodily rights and long-term well-being. It was really a heartbreaking episode in the human history, but I also want to emphasize the creative agencies of Chinese American women. So overall, my key questions include how did Chinese American women cope with the multiple crises of the pandemic and racism, build communities of support and fight for social justice? What agencies, solidarities, and strategies emerged or strengthened among Chinese American women in the processes? Theoretically, I integrate decolonizing feminist and anti-racist approaches to conduct research. So this is a table of contents. My new book has 7 chapters. The first chapter lays the theoretical foundations for my book. Especially, I articulate how to advance global Asian folklore studies, global Asian feminisms, and how to combat anti-Asian racism. So chapter 2 focuses on Chinese immigrant mothers and their political activisms during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think later I will focus on this chapter because I think their political activism have continued up to the present moment, and it's what we really need at this moment. And then chapter 3 focuses on Chinese women international students and their transnational experiences. So during the pandemic, many Chinese women international students faced discrimination in both the host countries and their home countries. So they were discriminated against in the US because of the surging anti-Asian racism, but at home, they were blamed that they spread the virus from thousands of miles away because when they returned from US back home. So some feel they were abandoned or unwanted on both sides. So chapter 4 focuses on Chinese adoptees, their anti-racist solidarities and remaking Chinese Asian American identities. So Chinese adoptees have been a very special social group in the US. Their emergence was related to China's one-child policy. So from 1979 to 2015, China implemented the one-child policy. So many infants or babies were abandoned. Many were girls. So in the 1990s, the international adoption programs were established in China. So many Chinese babies or infants were adopted to the U.S., especially by the middle-class white American families. So the chapter 4 really focuses on the adoptees and their struggles and challenges. And the chapter 5 focuses on Chinese lay Buddhist women and their diverse agencies in building the hybrid communities. This is really the continuation of my research before the COVID. As I said, before the COVID, I went back to China. I visited many different Buddhist temples in China, so collected lots of data. But then because of the COVID, I couldn't go back, so I started to study lay Buddhist women and their practices in the US. So that's how chapter 5 was written. And then chapter 6, I know Professor assigned this book chapter about fluid foodways. So this is a chapter integrating all the different voices and practices of Chinese immigrant mothers, women international students, adoptees, and lay Buddhist women. So I tried to show how they practice fluid foodways in different ways to exert agencies, build connections, and also sometimes advocate for social justice. And the final conclusion was the articulation of all the key points that I tried to highlight in the book. So first, I think I will introduce some key themes and methodologies from the first chapter, and then I will focus on the second chapter. So because the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic was so expensive and also very lasting, it was really hard to do the research. So in my book, I tried to integrate all the different methodologies together, including virtual ethnography, interviews, class surveys, and social media analysis. Especially for the interviews, my collaborators and I interviewed 86 participants. Most of them were Chinese and Chinese American women. So they were from various socioeconomic backgrounds with diverse life paths and cross-border experiences. So I think in the acknowledgements, I expressed my special thanks to President Andy Dai in the Huagan Chinese School in Florida, because at the beginning of this project, it was really hard for us to recruit contributors. So as everyone was going through the crisis back in or herself or themselves. So I think President Dai helped me to recruit lots of contributors, especially mothers from the Huagan Chinese School. And then I used snowball something through online groups, postings, Chinese school networks, and refers to recruit more contributors. And for the Chinese international students, I used my personal networks and also I draw on my research assistant's help to recruit contributors. And for the Chinese adoptees chapter, later I can tell more stories about how I recruit Chinese adoptees. It was a very challenging and hard process, but with the great help from many individuals and communities, finally we did interviews with 86 contributors. And in the book, I use personal narratives as a main method to both document the stories and also do my analysis. So personal narratives are well studied by many folklorists, and the narratives have been really important in many different fields, like in both humanities, social sciences, in medicine and health. So there were the narrative turn in the 1990s in both humanities, social sciences, and medicine and health. So the personal narratives serve to express experiences, identifications, and social dynamics. These narratives can raise awareness about systematic problems and promote social changes. And by telling their personal stories, individuals reclaim agency and challenging preconceptions and stereotypes. So in the introduction chapter, I highlight several key themes, including anti-Asian racism, global Asian folklore studies, and global Asian feminism. Here, I would love to focus on the anti-Asian racisms. Since race and racism are key concepts in my book, so I will start with some definitions. So I use Michael Omi and Howard Werner's definition for race. According to them, race, quote, is a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies, quote ends. It is a social construct that differs by time and place and draws upon arbitrary criteria for categorizing people. It, quote, has been a master category, a kind of template for patterns of inequality, marginalization, and difference throughout US history. No other social conflict, not class, not sex, gender, not colonialism or imperialism, can ever be understood independently of it, quote ends. Also, according to them, racism, quote, creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial significations and identities, quote ends. Strawhall argues that there are multiple racisms, which are always situated in particular social, economic, political, cultural, and historical contexts. These multiple racisms are all related, but distinctive in their origins and contours. The anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism triggered by COVID-19 echoes the long-standing issues of yellow perils and discrimination faced by Chinese and Asians in different parts of the world throughout the history of the Chinese and Asian diasporas. So in the introduction, I highlighted some key dark moments of anti-Asian racism. So the first key moment is the era of the Chinese exclusion. So the Page Act of 1875 was the first restrictive federal immigration law in the United States, targeting immigrants from China and other Asian countries. Although the law included provisions against contract laborers and convicts, it was almost heavily and effectively enforced against the Chinese women by presuming they were prostitutes. So on May 2nd, 1882, the first Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Then the 1904 Act followed, and Chinese immigration became severely restricted in the US. So during the era of the Chinese exclusion, when Chinese immigrants came to California, especially when they arrived at San Francisco, they were immediately sent to the Angel Island. It was like a prison. So the immigrants then were detained there for from several days up to probably 2 years or longer. So it became like a prison for not only for Chinese immigrants, but also for immigrants from other countries. So later the houses there built on Angel Island was burned. So later, right now, the places was rebuilt and it became a museum. So later, the Chinese American activists, they began to record this history. So they found the poems inscribed on the walls by Chinese immigrants when they were detained in the Angel Island. So the inscriptions and immigrant poetries were later collected and also translated into Chinese and published into books. So those poems became important records of the Chinese immigration, Chinese exclusion area. Another key moment of anti-Asian racism was the World War II Japanese American incarceration. So during the Second World War II, when Japanese armies attacked the naval bases in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941, so the American President Roosevelt then issued an executive order to detain all the Japanese and Japanese Americans in the US. So they were assigned to a number and then detained in the different concentration camps in very remote areas in the U.S. Minnie Okubo was one of those members who were detained in one of the concentration camps. She was an artist, then she used her paintings and drawing to record what happened during those in those concentration camps. So later she published the Citizen 13660. So then this book became very important for the Japanese and Japanese American activists to advocate for their rights. So I think because of their fighting, so later the U.S. government apologized to Japanese and Japanese American citizens and gave some compensations for those people who were detained there. So later I also articulate the harms of the myth of the model minority. So the concept of the model minority was invented by white journalists in the 1960s. So although the white journalists tried to praise the high achievements of many Asian and Asian Americans, but in reality it didn't protect Asian and Asian Americans from discrimination and unequal treatments. It brought more harms to Asian and Asian American communities, and also it paid Asian and Asian American communities against other communities of color. As we can see, the racisms continue to exist, and systematic racisms also continue to exist as structural and enduring. During the pandemic, the anti-Asian racism surged and became worse. So Donald Trump referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus and Kung flu, which fueled rising anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes. And also, conspiracy theories contributed to the surging of anti-Asian racism. Based on some conspiracy theories, China was blamed for the pandemic, including some accused China for deliberately creating a bioweapon in the labs and so on. Stop AAPI Hate was launched in March 2020. Their purpose was to collect reports of hate incidents against AAPI individuals. So from 2020 to 2022, they collected about at least 12,000 incidents against AAPI individuals, but those was only a small fraction of what really happened on the ground. So they also announced many national reports. According to some reports, almost 60 of the hate reports were women and girls, showing the intersection of racism and sexism that particularly affected Asian and Asian American women. And the majority of incidents were harassment. Most reported ethnic group was Chinese. And also the Atlanta school shootings was also a very key moment in both the anti-Asian racism and also during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in March 2021, one young white man went to 3 Asian spas in Atlanta. So he killed 8 people. 6 of them were Asian women, and some of them were undocumented immigrants. I think in book 5, I recorded the story of how local communities in Atlanta held a special funeral for one of the victims, Feng Daoyu, because her families couldn't be found, and then the local Chinese and Chinese American community just held a special funeral for her and buried her in Atlanta. So I think the Atlanta school shootings affected many people, and it became a wake-up call for many of us in the communities. So many of us feel unsafe in our everyday lives, but also many of us started to engage in particular activism to combat anti-Asian racism. Racism have detrimental effects on physical and mental health. The solutions could include public education, community safety solutions, and civil rights enforcement. the coalitions among AAPI communities push to advance social justice and civil rights. And in my book, I quote Professor Lisa Gilman's words when she wrote the introduction for the special issue about race and folklore studies in the Journal of American Folklore. My students really love this quote. So Lisa writes, "It is this blindness, this invisibility that can be the most insidious. Unless we recognize our own positionality, our own complicity, our own accountability, we as individuals, a field, a society will never change." Thank you so much, Professor Lisa Gilman. And also in the introduction, I advanced global Asian folklore studies by integrating the studies of global Asians and the new critical folklore studies. The frameworks of global Asians were promoted by Professor Tina Chen from the Pennsylvania State University and later promoted by Christina Yano, who was the former president of Association for Asian Studies. So Professor Christine Yano was the president during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, as a community, we face the surging anti-Asian racism. So she promoted the studies of global Asians to address the broader social injustice and promote the humanity and dignity and justice in our scholarship and also in our practice. And I integrate the studies of global Asians with the new critical folklore studies. I think many scholars, including folklorists here at George Mason, engage in new critical folklore studies in very different ways. So we emphasize the action-based and future-oriented approaches. And also, in the new critical folklore studies, we integrate transnational, interdisciplinary, intersectional, decolonial, and community-engaged approaches. So the purpose is to make the marginalized voices and groups visible and to make their contributions and struggles and challenges and achievements widely known. So I think, like for me, global Asian folklore studies is like a collaborative platform and also dynamic field for intellectual exchanges that transcend boundaries and divisions, and also for broader collaborations among scholars, activists, and communities, and so on. So AAPI women are often portrayed as passive, active victims rather than active agents in combating racism and sexism. So my book seeks to amplify their voices, actions, and advocacy for social justice and change, not only during the pandemic, but also in everyday lives. So I also advance the global Asian feminisms in my book. So the new frameworks are also based on the many existing frameworks of feminisms, including AAPI feminisms, women of color feminism, and transnational feminisms. Because of what really happened on the ground, I think we need broad frameworks to address anti-Asian racism and also to address the broader solidarities across racial and gender boundaries built by Chinese and Asian women on the ground. So the purpose is to challenge white feminist dominance and heteropatriarchy. So before I present my research in chapter 2, I also wanted to quickly present chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about Chinese adoptees. So when I prepared for my talk, one of my key contributors passed away. So Maya Simon drew this painting after the Atlanta special teams. Maya and her sister Zoe Simon were my superstar contributors. Especially Zoe shared her personal stories in the book. So I really want to acknowledge my deep gratitude to Maya and Zoe and for all the communities for their excellent contributions and political activism. So Zoe was my former student at the College of Worcester. I worked at the College of Worcester from 2015 to 2024. So then I started my work at the University of Georgia. So Zoe was first my student, and then she became my sophomore research assistant during her second year. So I had no purpose to study Chinese adoptee, and then one day Zoe came and said, Professor Yu, we should study Chinese adoptees. I'm one of them. I can help you recruit, the contributors. So she started to work as my sophomore research assistant. She actually worked as my research assistant for 2 years because of this project. So she recruited 26 contributors all over the U.S. I think she mainly used the Facebook groups because I think Chinese and Asian adoptees formed all kinds of Facebook groups and other online groups. So Zoe just shared my recruitment messages on those Facebook groups, and then she scheduled the interviews one by one. So in the chapter 4, I highlight some key themes, including like how Chinese adoptees came out of the fog, which means they are awakening to adoption's impacts and also anti-Asian racism's impacts. And also, I study the transracial adoption paradox. I think for Chinese adoptees, it was very challenging for them to find their sense of belonging because they feel that they have never been fully accepted in the US. And also many of them had a strong sense of in-betweenness, that they didn't feel fully white American nor Chinese Asian, so that they didn't belong anywhere. They feel that they were like American citizens, but they feel that they were never fully white Americans. But they also feel that they were never Chinese or Asian, since most adoptees were adopted when they were really young, like between several months up to 2 years old. So usually they were adopted by middle-class white American families. So they were often raised in white communities, and they often went to white schools and universities and colleges. So they didn't feel connection with their Chinese cultural traditions and heritages. But I think the pandemic changed their lives and also changed their thoughts in many complicated ways. So so coming out of the fog was from the adoptees, as Helen said in our interview. So there are many different perspectives from adopted people about their life circumstances, and for me, there is this term called the fog, which is the idea when adopted people start to understand how adoption impacts their life. Because I think before, when you are still in the fog, it's kind of this feeling of knowing you are adopted, or maybe even not knowing you are adopted, and thinking that, oh, I am, but it has no impact on my life. But then coming out of the fog would be understanding your origins, your roots, being more curious about where you come from, really exploring how did the adoption work with the legal aspects of it, being curious about all that, and really seeing some of the pitfalls and actually a lot of negatives within the adoption community. So when I did my research, many adoptees said that they were deprived of their agencies when they were young, since the adoption choices were made really early during their lives. The choices were made probably by the international adoption programs and by their adoptive families. Some feel that they had no agency in deciding their life choices. But in the book, I argue that they do have complicated agencies. So during the pandemic, some contributors broke silence and confronted racism directly. They built adoption networks, both online and offline, to advocate for API rights, and also they built alliances with other marginalized groups. So I do want to argue that they have agencies, so they can decide what kind of life they want to live, even though some felt that they lost their agencies early in their lives. So in the book, I used Zoe Simon as a star contributor. She co-organized multiple Asian Lives at the College Wooster after the Atlanta special shootings with other Asian and Asian American students. So the students leaders also give really powerful speeches at the marches. They use their personal stories to share the impacts of the anti-Asian racism and also to advocate for social changes. So after the multiple Asian Lives, as requested by student leaders, I designed and taught the anti-Asian racism class at the College Wooster, and also we co-organized the AAPI lecture series. And then as final projects of this class, four Asian American students organized the annual AAPI Arts Festivals at the College Wooster. So they intended to show all the contributions, talents, and also their cultural traditions by organizing the art festivals. So now I will focus on chapter 2 about Chinese immigrant mothers. So motherhood and marrying has been a hot topic recently. There are some new books and also articles and book chapters about them, but I found that in the English language work about motherhood and mothering, Chinese mothers were often ignored. So first I thought probably because of language barriers, because if, for example, those scholars, if they wanted to interview Chinese immigrant mothers, they probably need to learn how to speak Chinese. So I thought probably that was the biggest barrier for scholars to engage in the studies of Chinese mothers. But for my research, luckily, as I'm one of the committee members, I did engage with lots of Chinese immigrant mothers, and also I'm one of them. I have 2 kids, so I send them to Chinese schools. So I then got to know many other Chinese immigrant mothers. Whenever I go to somewhere, I often join the mothers group first. Like there are often mothers groups in the different locations. So in the book, so in the chapter, I used like the virtual ethnography and interviews to do the research. The chapter links mothering to anti-racist organizing and policy advocacy. Especially, I highlight how those mothers collaborate with broader allies to promote the AAPI history bills in K-12 classrooms. And also I conceptualize community of support as infrastructure for everyday activism. So by the end of the chapter, I offer policy recommendations and reframe parenting as collective responsibility. So when I did my research about the Chinese immigrant mothers, I mainly draw on the platform WeChat. WeChat is the most popular Chinese social media platform. It's like the combination of both X and Facebook. WeChat became my main field site during the COVID, especially during the early lockdown. So I joined many different groups, especially mothers groups, many Chinese schools groups, and also many other groups. So I observed all kinds of debates, coordination, mutual aid, and advocacy in the WeChat groups. So I think the WeChat enables transnational research across borders, especially during lockdowns, since almost everyone stayed at home. I try to, methodologically, emphasize WeChat's functions as a virtual ethnic town hall and as a platform for virtual ethnography and recruitment. So a virtual ethnic town hall was from another Asian American scholar who also did research about Asian communities. So I feel that WeChat functions as a virtual ethnic town hall when Chinese and Chinese American individuals can debate on all kinds of issues and then decide to take on actions on some agendas. So for the community of support, I by emphasizing this concept, I want to show how the Chinese immigrant mothers and also other Asian and Asian American individuals blend horizontal care, transnational solidarity, and resistance against oppression. So during hard times, like we often get together and support each other and build communities collectively and then collectively advocate for social changes. So communities of support were formed or strengthened amid rising anti-racism, and they were grounded in belonging claims, as some of my contributors claim, we belong here, we are not foreigners. So in this chapter, I also introduce the ideas of intensive motherhood. Intensive motherhood. Intensive motherhood was coined by Sharon Hayes to describe the, quote, child-centered, expert-guided, emotional absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive, quote, undertaking that motherhood had become by the mid-1990s in the US. So intensive motherhood was really based on white American middle-class paradigms. So the intensive motherhood had been challenged by scholars of color and also other scholars because of its white American paradigms. But here, while challenging this concept, I use many cases from the COVID-19 pandemic, especially from Chinese immigrant mothers, to really challenge these paradigms because it was really impossible to achieve or to reach by mothers. So during the pandemic, especially early the lockdowns, school and daycares were often closed. And then basically all the institutional care support was dismantled during lockdowns. So kids and mothers often had to stay at home. So really the childcare burdens often fell on the shoulders of mothers. And also the work from home blurs boundaries for work and life for many professional mothers. And also, in order to protect children and navigate hostility, Chinese immigrant mothers carried extra burdens for risk management and emotional labor. So in chapter 2, I analyze 4 key things, including gendered pandemic and intensive motherhood, diverse life and work experiences of Chinese immigrant mothers, activist mothering, and political activism of Chinese immigrant mothers. Finally, everyday activisms and the communities of support. So I think during my interviews, many moms feel that they were exhausted and burned out for all the extra burdens that they have to carry during the pandemic. So when the institutional care support systems were dismantled, often the burdens were given to the mothers. And also the good mother expectations intensified mothers' obligations amid uncertainties and racism. So I tried to present how Chinese immigrant mothers negotiate patriarchal family structures while protecting children and also taking care of themselves. So in addition to all the extra burdens, like the lion's share, some of my contributors also faced economic precarity, layoffs, and emotional toll. So Wu Meili lost her job in March 2020, and then she said the hardest time during the pandemic was when I was laid off. It was when it was very painful. I made a list every day. I have been looking for jobs every week. So I think some mothers were stay-at-home mothers. So some of their husbands also lost their jobs during the pandemic. So layoffs became like both financial and psychological ruptures for many families. And even though some mothers lost their jobs, but they need to take care of their children at home. As Wu Meili also said, she was no less busy, even though she didn't make money. So she still need to do all the housework and all the care work at home. And the job search became part of daily survival strategies for Wu Meili and other mothers and sometimes fathers who lost their jobs. And for the professional mothers who still could keep their jobs, they faced some other challenges. PP was a junior professor at One University. She said, I feel like my work efficiency has dropped by at least 30% because of the children are constantly making noise. I think PP got the support from both her parents and her parents-in-laws. So she got the intergenerational support. But for many mothers, they didn't have that kind of support. So they really had to rely on themselves to do everything. And for professional mothers, when they worked at home, home became office, classroom, and daycare center. So all the boundaries collapsed. So many feel burned out, and they couldn't build boundaries among their lives. So even in some like equal relation households, the gendered labor persists because mostly mothers had to take extra burdens in housework and childcare work. And the productivity impacts accumulate into career consequences. I think during the pandemic, some universities proposed the 10 o'clock pause for some working parents. So in the book, I cited lots of personal narratives from my contributors. YY was also a junior professor at a liberal arts college. She said, I have to work during the day, take care of my children, do housework, and do many other things. I get up very early in the morning, and maybe at 4 or 5 o'clock, then work. I sleep very little every day. So Amy was a stay-at-home mother. So she also felt burned out during lockdowns. So in our interview, she said, but because my 2 children have to study at home, their schedules interfere with each other. So all my time from morning to afternoon is almost blocked by my children, focusing on their homework. Their rest time is when I have to prepare 3 meals. So she was busy from the morning to the evening. There were also some silver linings on dark clouds. Like some mothers said they had some quality time and intimacy with their children. Like Wu Meili said, what makes me happy is being able to spend more time with my daughter. Our quality time together is precious. And Lin was a restaurant owner. She said, our restaurant was closed. If we opened, we were afraid. If we didn't open, we were afraid that we couldn't support ourselves. This pandemic made my children happy. Their mother could spend more time with them. And also another mother, Meng Nan, said, actually, the most heroic and greatest are our children, the little ones. Suddenly everything changed and the whole world turned upside down, right? They are the ones who are most eager to communicate with people and have close contact with people at that age. And then in the chapter, I really focus on the political activisms of Chinese immigrant mothers. So they took collectivist orientation and biocultural identification as political resources to advocate for social changes. So their activism challenges stereotypes and structures that marginalize AAPI communities. And mothering thus becomes a pathway to leadership, coalition building, and policy advocacy. So I gave many detailed examples in the book. I think especially I focus on the API history bills. So by 2023, at least 11 states passed the API history bills, which requires the teaching of API history in often social studies curriculum. Thank you. So I focus on some very special groups, especially the Make Us Visible New Jersey and the Parents and Children Education Club. So Illinois was the first state to enact the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, which requires schools to include Asian American history in the social studies curriculum. And New Jersey was the second state to pass the API history bills. So by these cases, I want to show how visibility becomes a legislative project anchored in parenting organizing. As my contributors articulated, belonging is an action. So in addition to advancing API history bills, they engaged in all kinds of activities to advocate for API rights. Because of time limits, I will skip some parts. So in the book, I use Make Us Visible New Jersey as a case study. So they collaborated with 63 civil organizations in New Jersey to promote the API history bills. So they also made multilingual outreach to lawmakers and communities and framed education as an antidote to hate discrimination. In conclusion, Chinese immigrant mothers' pandemic experiences are shaped by intersecting identities and by racism and care burdens. So communities of support enable mutual aid, belonging, and pathways from everyday care to civic political actions. And the chapter also proposes policy directions, including recognizing child rearing as significant work, reimagining parenting beyond gendered and patriarchal expectations. I'm almost end my conclusion. So I think originally I deleted all my parts about chapter 6 about fluid fluids, but then Professor Ben told me that he assigned this chapter, so I will try to summarize the key points of chapter 6 in 1 minute. So here I, inspired by Zygmunt Bauman's theory of liquid modernity, I try to emphasize the forever becoming and never ending foodways. Fluid foodways show how Chinese and Chinese American women use Chinese food traditions not to just physically survive, but as a powerful method for identity formation, community building, and social engagement that helps them to navigate a society shaped both by the pandemic and the systematic racism. So there are different stories integrated together in this chapter. So if you have interest, you can read more and learn more. So I also assigned this book to my own students in my Women and Writing East Asian class. Students really love the part about the lunchbox incident, so they had lots of discussions and debates about that. They told me that the experiences were universal among many kids, not just among Asian American kids, but also among other immigrant groups. So in conclusion, small acts of support ripple into lasting changes. I think every one of us can do to make our society a better society, can make our future better for everyone. Thank you so much.
We have time for a couple of questions.
So what's your opinion, because especially in the short amount of time between the pandemic and now, there's such a rampant Asian hate agenda, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, there's so many people almost fetishizing Asian culture today, especially in social media. And I know chapter 6 especially was about food, but all these a lot of white articles claiming they have like Asian taste buds or saying they're like an Asian time of their life because they enjoy very like common Asian foods while still dating on like very like not abnormal but like lesser common Asian foods such as like chicken feet and stuff. Like, what's your opinion on like how like that can like really be like especially confusing for the identity confusion or like confusion for like people who are like Asian or like who are adopted or mixed, etc.
Thank you so much for your brilliant questions. I think this question was also asked by my own students. I think they also feel that, for example, sometimes some American people love Chinese foods or Asian foods. They love K-pop music and the culture, but they discriminated against Asian people and so on. We did see the conflicts and tensions. I think some of my students also articulate the sense of in-betweenness, that they feel that they were trapped somewhere, they were never fully American, also never fully Chinese or Asian. I think, thank you so much. I think the realities are always complicated and complex. I think definitely right now, anti-Asian racisms were exaggerated again. So we still need to fight. So in both everyday lives and also in like many possible ways. I think every of us can find our own solutions, even started with small actions to like educate people. That's what my students often say. So we will start with education. So we need to let some people realize that some people didn't know that they have racist biases and so on. The education was always the first steps. And also we also need collective actions. And usually systematical changes and social changes take time. So they need us to do whatever we can, both in short term and in long term, to make the changes. So I'm still hopeful that I know we are still in a very challenging moment, but if we do whatever we can, starting with small steps and actions, and also if we work together, eventually we can make the real changes. Yeah. We just need to keep fighting. Thank you. Yeah.
I was very curious about the multiple kinds of racisms and feminisms that you referred to in your presentation. And I was wondering if you could identify a little bit more about what those are and their distinct different origins.
That's another brilliant question. I think for racisms, so different scholars, some scholars have brilliant researches. I think Strohal definitely have lots of work about racisms. So they use different terms like systematic racisms, individual racisms, interpersonal racisms, and also some use like microaggressions and other terms to define the everyday racisms that we face. And also I think some other scholars use some other words. So I did see, like my focus is really on the anti-Asian racisms in the book. So I tried to connect the yellow perils, which also existed for a long time, like the discrimination against Chinese and Asian diasporas. I tried to connect the rhetorics of the yellow perils with the newest like Chinese virus and Kung Flu rhetorics, and also other rhetorics. I think they are all very harmful. So sometimes when I presented my research, I once encountered one white audience, especially about the lunchbox incident, and the person will say like, "Oh, the kids didn't know that it was not a racist incident. They didn't mean that." So I definitely encountered denial of that. As you can see, racism really exists everywhere, and some people didn't recognize them. So that didn't form. So I think for every of us, we can always like find probably new articulations, new forms of anti-racisms. But also when I shared my scholarship with other communities of color, not with just Asian and Asian Americans, for example, Latinx communities, some scholars told me that they face similar discrimination and struggles. They were also discrimination against because of their faith or something else or whatever. And I think for the feminisms, so there are many different forms of feminisms. So like for me, originally when I engaged in feminism, my focus is really on Chinese feminism, all kinds of Chinese feminism, especially the state feminism, and also all kinds of like DIY feminisms and made in China feminism, all kinds of feminisms. But when I started, when I did my research for this book, I found that all the existing theories and framework couldn't help me solve the puzzles. So none of them could really explain all the different contours of fascisms and provide a solution to them. So I started to read like other fascism, like black feminist works, and also like feminist works, like transnational feminisms. I used many works, women of color feminisms. So I think there were, each for those feminisms, there were often different schools and scholars. Though they also published many important books. So for me, I just want to see how they address different forms of discrimination, like sexism and racism, and how they can help me address those issues and provide actionable solutions to the issues. I think I owe gratitude to many black feminists and also feminists, feminists of color. So I really, so during the pandemic, I suspended my reading for Chinese feminists for a while, and I engaged in readings in black feminist works and also women of color feminist works. So then I found, okay, even though the different forms of feminism were situated within different national or global contexts, but I found the connections and the coalitions. So I termed the global Asian feminisms to address the anti-Asian racisms, because I think some scholars may term it as global anti-Asian racisms. So I like that term too. So I think for those broader global issues, we also need broader theoretical frameworks for feminisms and also for actions. Thank you for your brilliant questions. I saw 2 more questions. I will start 3 more. Okay.
I noticed in the first chapter you noted that Buddhist Chinese women are often excluded from religious studies. Why do you think that is?
Thank you for your excellent question. I think there are probably the first barrier might be the language barrier again. And also, I think for the religion studies, I think when scholars study Buddhism, they often study Buddhism like in Asia, like in China, Japan, South Korea, and also in many other like nation states. And also I saw some recent new books about the Buddhist women. So I think they did study, like I will use Buddhism as one example because there were all kinds of different religions, traditions. But I think for my own study, I tried to cross some borders. So I tried to focus on lay Buddhist women in both China and in the US. I feel that sometimes they face very similar struggles. So I think right now, I think gender perspectives also became very important in religion studies. I think definitely we need more scholars, more women scholars to study women religious practices. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think something that's exaggerated a lot of particularly Chinese aid is the current administration's attitude towards China. And I think the average American's experience with China is through the news, through often exaggerated things like social credit, or to less than extent the treatment of leader people. As someone who's been to China multiple times, what would you say something is just gap between American perception and the realities of China?
Thank you so much. This is another brilliant question. I think the situation has changed dramatically. I'm actually working on another article. Ironically, the image of China actually has been promoted and has been the positive image of China has been raised ironically since Trump became the president. Because of what's going on in the US, actually the image of China is rising globally. So I saw some recent reports. It's not because what China did something, because China didn't do many things. So ironically, the image changed. So I think right now the China-US relationships also have been improved. I think because of media and social media are double source. I think sometimes the information in media and social media exaggerated stereotypes, but sometimes they can do also positive influence. Especially, I think early this year or last year, the Red Note became a popular platform among American users. So I saw lots of really harmonious cultural exchanges among young Chinese and American audiences. And also, I hope that kind of cultural exchanges, I hope we will have more equal cultural exchanges like that in the future. Thank you so much.